Today's shipwreck video will be a bit of a different one. We'll be returning to a look at multiple ships in one video, specifically the destroyer wrecks in Ormoc Bay. The reason for this will become apparent as we look at those wrecks. I've previously covered the more detailed ones in Shimakaze, Ward, and Wakatsuki. The remaining wrecks, Naganami, Hamanami, and USS Cooper, are not as detailed, not enough to justify standalone videos at any rate. So those three will be covered here. If you're interested in the other wrecks, I'll link those in the description. For now, let's begin this look at Ormoc Bay with the most recognizable of the wrecks, the Japanese destroyer Hamanami. Before we look at the wreck itself, I'll give the usual brief overview of the sinking. This will also apply to Naganami in most respects, other than the direct sinking itself, because both of these destroyers, along with Shimakaze and Wakatsuki, were sunk in the same action. That came on November 11th, 1944, when they were escorting a troop convoy to Ormoc. This action was one of many in the area, as American and Japanese forces contested the location. The action on November 11th just happened to be the worst for the Japanese Navy destroyers. They would lose 4 in one day, all of which were sent down by air attack from Task Force 38. These carrier-based aircraft descended upon the Japanese, striking each of the destroyers and the transports they were escorting. Various degrees of damage were dealt to each ship, but in the end they all sank, with the exception of Asashimo, which managed to escape the massacre. As for Hamanami in particular, the ship was blown in two. American action reports indicate the bow was blown off before the ship sank. And indeed, the wreck is missing its bow. During this sinking, 63 men were killed and 42 were wounded. 167 survivors were plucked from the water, which was actually quite a lot compared to the other destroyers. Now, before I move on, it is worth noting two things. While American reports indicate the ship was blown in two, Japanese wiki has a story of the ship remaining afloat, and, in fact, being boarded by survivors of Naganami who got the destroyer moving again, before running out of water for the boilers and abandoning Hamanami to sink later on. Take what you will from that, but the usual thing of wiki giant mountain of salt still applies here. The second note for its part comes from the Facebook comments, where a Japanese commenter asked how Petrol was sure this was Hamanami and not Naganami. The question wasn't answered, so it is possible this is actually Naganami. Petrol did comment on the other wreck, but we'll get to that later. For now, I'll trust Petrol on this identification. Just bear in mind that it could be the other Yugamo-class destroyer sunk during this battle. In any case, we can look at the wreck now. This was located on January 20th, 2018 by RV Petrol, at a depth of 325 meters, or 1,066 feet. While a relatively shallow wreck in this regard, the ship is actually in pretty decent shape, aside from missing the bow. This means all the following pictures come from the stern section, where we begin with the two aft turrets. These confirm the ship to be a Yugamo as their 127mm 5-inch weapons, not the 100mm guns Wakatsuki carried. And the other features of the ship, like the torpedo tubes, confirm this wasn't Shimakaze. As for the turrets here, they're a bit obscured by darkness. What we can see, however, is broadly intact. Neither mount shows a huge amount of battle damage or rusting out. The barrels are all in place, and neither of them have been blown off the ship. You can even make out the details of the shape, like the raised portions here. That said, while the turrets are good, the same can't be said for the hull. Looking at the orientation of the capstans here, it's apparent the deck collapsed. Those should be vertical, as you can see on Naganami here. They're horizontal on this wreck, which does mean we're looking at the side of the ship, folded over. Beyond that, there's not much to speak of. The raised mounting of the super firing turret can be seen here, along with scattered debris. Everything else is too dark to make out real detail. So let's move on to the next weapon, one of the ubiquitous Japanese 25mm guns. This one was mounted on the stern. Emphasis on was. As you can see here, it's been broken off the hull. The mounting is no longer attached, and the gun is resting on its side, and so heavily corroded and overgrown that you can't see much detail. The hull around it is little better. I believe this is the extreme stern, judging from what appears to be a depth charge here, and this might be the rounded edge of the stern next to it. As for the box in the foreground, I'm not sure what that was. If anyone has an idea, let me know in the comments. It's pretty intact, whatever it is. Either way, this rounds things off here. One more picture of weaponry, then we can move to the hull. In this case, one of the torpedo mounts. Petrol notes this as the aft mount, with Hamanami split at the forward torpedo mount. Regardless of which one this is, the general area is pretty bad. There's almost nothing visible here, but scattered debris and mud. The torpedo tubes are broken, with only 2 visible, along with a single torpedo that fell out of one of the tubes, mostly buried, with only a little paint showing towards the back. And that torpedo isn't just buried by mud either. It's also got a rangefinder sitting on top of it. Petrol says this is the rangefinder for the torpedo mount itself, and the torpedo mount for its part has a 25mm gun resting on top of it. Not something you see every day, to say the least. Without much else to cover here, let's move to the hull. First, we have a look at the stern deck. There's more evidence of it collapsing here, such as a degaussing cable resting horizontal. Much like the capstans earlier, this should be vertical on the side. It being angled like this means the hull is collapsed in, like on Chokai or Maya if you've watched those videos. Except here we can see the deck falling away entirely. The ship broke here, just like at the bow. Unfortunately, I can't say much beyond that. It's too dark to see anything else, other than a gaping hole here, and where the side of the ship ends here. Moving back from there, we have what looks like another pair of 25mm guns, and some sort of storage behind them, with what might be a boat davit between the two. The deck itself is buried in mud, so there's no detail to make out, which means we can move to the last picture of this wreck, the bottom of the stern, where we can see part of a shaft, and the tip of the prop buried in the mud, as well as the side of the ship showing more of how it's bowed in. The degaussing cable here demonstrates that angle pretty well. Interestingly, you can also see the rusting pattern here, and how the ship is split open with some of the side plating falling away. It's certainly rough, although not quite as bad as Shimakaze was. However, that does wrap up Hamanami, with the exception of the sonar, which I save for last because it doesn't show much in the way of detail. You can only barely make out the shape of the hull, and not much else. So let's move on to the other Japanese destroyer of this video, Naganami. Most of what I said earlier about Hamanami applies here in regard to the sinking. Attacked by American carrier aircraft on November 11th, 1944, and sent to the bottom. Moreover, the ship was also broken in two, just like her sister ship, right amidships as it turned out. You can probably see why there's some debate on which ship Petrol found in which location. These two destroyers, if reports are to be believed, sank in very similar circumstances. It's not entirely impossible that they got mixed up in reports. Either way, I'm going to cover them as Petrol identified the wrecks. Just keep in mind there is some wiggle room here. The destroyer that Petrol identified as Naganami was discovered first in any event. The wreck was located in December of 2017 at a depth of 252 meters, or 827 feet, so notably shallower than the previous wreck. This is reflected to some extent in the condition of the hulk, which is, well, there's a reason I'm covering multiple wrecks in one video. The following pictures are so bad in terms of condition that there's little to say on them individually. Take, for example, the bow here, or what's left of it. As you can see, it's not very much. There's some of the anchor chain visible, along with some pieces of deck. But beyond that, there's very little. Just broken pieces and mud. It's here where Petrel makes note of how they identified the ships. To quote directly, "You can see the chain and some deck machinery. This is why I don't think this ship could be the Hamanami, unless this piece was hanging below the ship. Make of that what you will as we move to the next picture, which is what remains of the bow turret fallen off the ship. From what little we can see here, the turret is pretty badly beat up, with most of the face missing and rusting very prevalent. There's not much else to make out here other than some debris in this area, and the bow section barely visible in the background. Things don't get better as we continue on. Here's a 25mm gun with most of the mount covered in mud, and the gun itself has largely fallen apart, much like the broken deck beneath it. Looking at the angle of the gun, the deck, and this davit, it's pretty safe to say this area is buckled and bowed out. I'm almost impressed the gun and davit remained in place, along with a spool of cable here. This next 25mm gun is in marginally better shape, although pointing straight up. It's also covered in fishing lines, which are apparently a major hazard on this wreck. That might be why she's in such bad shape. Naganami, if she's in a busy fishing lane, would be damaged by that action, in the same way the Jutland wrecks are damaged by fishing. As for this picture, the only other things of note are the deck and the debris. The deck is in decent enough shape. The debris, on the other hand, I'm not sure about. It might be pieces of the superstructure, but I can't say for certain. Petrel notes this is right before the break, so it could also be from that. That break is interesting because it apparently leads down into a large crater, evident here when looking at a set of torpedo tubes. Those are angled down into the crater. Exactly what caused that crater is an open question. It might have been the explosion that broke the ship in two, if this is Naganami. It might also have been from impacting the bottom. Either way, it's an interesting detail. Unfortunately, there's not much detail on the tubes themselves. Just a bit of piping here and the ends of the tubes, along with more broken metal and fishing line. The next picture is even worse in that regard. Just a pile of twisted metal with only a couple recognizable bits. What looks like the barrels of a triple 25mm mount right here. And beneath that, what might be a torpedo tube. Everything else is too busted up to make out. The second to last shot here is the other set of torpedo tubes. Petrel noted it as such, but it's hard to tell. The rest of the ship is too far in the darkness to make out, but this is apparently inside the crater. Not much else to say, so let's move to the last picture of this wreck. A final pair of 25mm guns on the deck. This is probably the most intact part of the ship we've seen, though most of it is out of frame. You can see the side of the hull here, and some more debris is in the background. The color is also apparent, matching up pretty well with pictures of Shimakaze. This is most likely an environmental effect. In any event, it wraps up Naganami. Let's move on to the single American wreck of this video, USS Cooper, an Allen M. Sumner class destroyer. This ship was sunk after the other two. Cooper went down on December 3, 1944, in an engagement with a pair of Japanese destroyers. One of them, Take, managed to torpedo Cooper. This did what Japanese torpedoes tended to do. It broke Cooper in two after a massive explosion on her starboard side. The ship sank within a minute. The explosion was so catastrophic. Because of Japanese forces in the area, only 168 of the crew were rescued. 191 men lost their lives in Cooper's sinking. For its part, the wreck was located in 2005. A diver, Rob Lalumiere, dove down to the hulk. At a depth of 193 meters, or 633 feet, Cooper is the shallowest wreck for today. But that is still well deeper than most divers will ever go. Petrel, meanwhile, surveyed the wreck in December of 2017. and confirmed it was Cooper beyond a shadow of a doubt, though the sonar certainly isn't showing that. It shows the ship broke in the shape of an L on the seabed, but not much more than that, and the survey of the wreck doesn't shed much more light here, being as there's only 5 pictures released. First, one of the twin 5-inch gun mounts. This is in good shape considering the situation. The rangefinder ears remain in place, as do the barrels, and it hasn't fallen off the ship. It is very rusty, as could be expected. Unfortunately, there's nothing else to note here, just some of the deck and some superstructure barely visible here. The torpedo tubes are arguably more interesting. Not only are these still aboard the ship, they're in remarkable shape. Relatively little growth, and each tube is still in place. Even the shield is still there, without a single sign of damage. This is not something you normally see on either American or Japanese wrecks. It's almost like something out of a museum. While not quite as pretty, the depth charge rack on the port side is similarly intact. All the charges are still in place, and the rack itself hasn't fallen apart. It looks like it's starting to towards the end, but it hasn't as of yet. As for the stern itself, you can see the curve of it, as well as the prop guard here, and what seems to be an anti-aircraft gun here, probably a 20mm cannon. The depth charge launcher here is not quite as good. There's much more rusting and overall corrosion. It's still recognizable, but between fishing nets and marine growth, it's in worse shape. The same goes for the structure behind it, which is basically unrecognizable. On the positive side, the deck is mostly intact here, although the mud obscures any real detail. In any case, however, we've now reached the end of the video, with Cooper's bow resting on its side. There's not much detail here again, but we do have the port side anchor, which is still fixed in place after all these years. With this shallow depth, there's not the kind of visible detail you would see on deeper wrecks, but it remains a striking image and a perfect place to end this video. There are still other wrecks yet to be discovered in Ormoc Bay. Perhaps I'll return for a follow-up video at some point in the future. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.